Hello, everyone. Welcome back to St. Louis Teens. Today, we are here with Professor Dan Schrag, who is the professor of Geology, Environmental Science, and Engineering, and is the director of Harvard University Center for the Environment. Professor Schrag, you have worked extensively on geochemistry and climatology, energy technology, and policy, in addition to increasing public and political awareness of the problem. Thank you so much for your phenomenal service and being here with us today.
It's great to be here with you, Sri.
Professor Schrag, thank you so much again. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and what drove you to the field of environmental science?
So I grew up in New York City, and I don't think I actually ever climbed a mountain bigger than, 1,200 feet until I was in college sometime. I wasn't a huge outdoor person and wasn't necessarily an environmentalist, but I always knew that I wanted to do something that mattered to people, that was somehow at the interface of science and policy. And in some ways I got lucky. In graduate school, when I was a student at Berkeley, the University of California at Berkeley, I got interested in some aspects of climate change, and that interest just grew and grew. And then as I was studying the science of ancient climates and Earth history, I got a little frustrated. I was talking about climate change and how global warming was affecting people. And then I didn't have much to say about what to do about it. And so I gradually became more and more interested, not just in what the problem is, but also what the solution is and how to think about how to fix it. And so that led me to not just technology, but also policy.
And from your standpoint now, what are some of our country's climate success stories and where do we stand today?
So climate change is probably the most difficult problem that human society around the world has ever faced. And that's really, I think of it for sort of two major reasons. One, because it's a collective action problem. And what that means is that the whole world is contributing to it, not equally. Some of us are contributing more than others. The US is certainly leading the way, at least per capita in terms of emissions. But it's a global problem. Everybody contributes, and that means it requires a global solution. And in general, humans aren't so good at working together around the world. We tend to be tribal, we tend to be nationalistic. So global cooperation is not our strong suit. And then the other aspect of climate change that makes it incredibly hard is that many aspects of the climate system have really long timescales. So the ocean takes centuries to millennia to mix and store the heat and heat up. The ice sheets take hopefully centuries or millennia to melt and sea level to rise. And then the energy systems can't change overnight. We can't just rebuild them. We're very dependent on fossil fuels, and we're not willing to just give them up overnight. All those things together mean that there are really long timescales. And humans are also really bad at long timescales. We like to respond to acute crises. We don't deal with slow-moving ones.
And I think you talking about that long time frame and often the little bit of difficulty that we may face in working with, other nations, it becomes difficult often to solve a problem if there isn't necessarily a consensus about it. And despite all our research and data, do we still lack that common consensus of what the problem is? And if so, why?
Yeah, actually, what's interesting is there's been a fabricated lack of consensus. In reality, the science of climate change is really old. A famous physical chemist named Svante Arrhenius, who was the first Swedish scientist to win a Nobel Prize just after the earliest part of the 20th century. In 1896, Svante Arrhenius wrote a beautiful paper that pretty much laid out the physics of climate change. And, he didn't get everything perfectly correct, but given that he did it in 1896, it's pretty damn impressive. And, we've learned a lot since then. We have far better observations. We now know much more about how the system works in detail. But essentially the same basic physics of the greenhouse effect is true today as it was in 1896. And so a lot of the uncertainty about whether climate change is happening and how much, that's fabricated because the vested interests, in particular the fossil fuel industry, literally paid hundreds of millions of dollars to people to sow confusion. That's what they've done intentionally. And so the reality is, in the scientific community, there really isn't much uncertainty about what's happening. There's plenty of uncertainty about what we might expect. That's the nature of the problem. We're changing the climate in a way that hasn't happened for millions of years. And no scientist can predict the future with perfect accuracy. But we have to think about it like a risk analysis. We have to say, what's at stake here? And really, should we be rolling these dice to figure out what's going to happen?
And Professor Schrag, you served on President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. And with your experience there, what are our biggest barriers to climate change in terms of being able to pass legislation?
Well, I think it's important to understand, first of all, serving on PCAST for me under President Obama was an incredible honor. I met regularly with some of the smartest people in the science and technology field from across the nation, and I learned so much. So it was an incredible learning opportunity for me. And the president and all of the people in the White House that I experienced were dedicated to their work and really trying to do the right thing. President Obama, especially in his second term, was genuinely committed to trying to do something about climate change. But the problem, as you say, is ultimately he didn't get any legislation through. And that's because Congress, for most of the Obama presidency, was controlled by the Republicans. And in our current political system, remember, our political system is designed to not get much done. And, we really haven't had any serious climate legislation since the Clean Air Act of 1970. There was a famous Supreme Court case called Massachusetts versus EPA that the Supreme Court ultimately decided in favor of Massachusetts and the other states that brought the lawsuit. This was during the George W. Bush administration. And what they were suing was to recognize that carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas is a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. Now, the truth is, when Congress passed the Clean Air Act in 1970 in the Nixon administration, nobody was really thinking about the problem of climate change and greenhouse gases. And so the question was, does carbon dioxide count in the Clean Air Act, and can it be regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency? And the Supreme Court says, yes, you can regulate. The EPA does have the authority. The Bush administration was saying, no, we can't regulate it because it's not a pollutant. We don't even have the authority. And the Supreme Court says, yes, you do. So what Obama did was start to regulate CO2 under something called the Clean Power Plan. It turned out that later got hung up in the courts, and it's still not clear whether that plan was okay. It became moot because Donald Trump took over. But in the long run, executive authority isn't sufficient. We can't have a pendulum going back and forth and expect serious long-term action on climate change. So ultimately, Congress has got to get in the game. And the question is, are we close to that? I don't know. I think a lot depends on this coming election.
And how do you think that we can more effectively use legislation to better combat climate change while keeping in mind the potential freedoms of people and businesses, which often can cause that pushback on legislation?
Well, so what's interesting is that in the field of economics, you can usually find disagreement all over the place on any issue. But when it comes to climate change, economists are almost unanimous in advocating for one simple solution. They see climate change as an externality, something that the market doesn't take into account. The effect of our pollution on the whole, on the community through changing the climate. And they have a simple solution for that, which is put a price on carbon. If you actually put a price on that carbon pollution, we would consider that, invest in other technologies, and gradually the problem would take care of itself. What's very important is that we don't just put a price on carbon through a carbon tax or a carbon dividend, but actually that the price goes up over time. People have to know that the price is going to be higher in the future, and therefore they invest for the long run. They invest in technology that ultimately solves the problem. Some colleague of mine who was a brilliant thinker, a man named Ted Halstead, he actually just died a few weeks ago in a horrible hiking accident in Spain. But Ted Halstead was the head of something called the Republican Climate proposal, which was a carbon dividend. So this was essentially a carbon tax, but instead of the government taking the money would all get returned to the taxpayers. So they would put a price on carbon and it would go up every year a little bit faster than inflation. But then it would actually, all the money would go back to people. There were a lot of prominent Republicans who supported this idea. And I still think it's probably the best idea that might get bipartisan support in a future Congress. I think something like that is really important. And I think most economists would agree that that's the way to do it. If you actually put that price on carbon, yes, as you said, there will be opponents from companies, but there'll also be supporters. So the oil companies will not like that. But if you make the ramp slow enough so that their investments they've made today can still earn them money, and they can have long enough to invest in the future, then everybody's on a level playing field. No question, there'll be companies like coal companies that will resist, that will pay lots of money to stop it. But solar and wind companies will pay a lot of money to support it. And so you'll see a little bit of a fight in the marketplace, and that's a good thing.
And I think that talking about those bipartisan solutions that we can get consensus about to really move forward and start to look at the potential solutions and when we can start to reach climate neutrality is so important. And the European Union is targeting to reach climate neutrality by 2030. And just last week, China announced that it will become carbon neutral by 2060. And although this is encouraging, how can we work to push our timeframes up even further?
So Sri, in my class that I teach at Harvard, I force students to design a zero carbon energy system for the US. Sector specific, transportation, residential and commercial buildings, industry, and then ultimately the electricity sector as well. And the reason I force students to do that instead of just telling them, lecturing to them about it, is because I want them to understand this at a more fundamental level. The goals that some European countries are talking about, first of all, most of them are 2050, not 2030. But even 2050, I think, is highly unlikely, unfortunately. I would love to be wrong about this. I would love all of us to decarbonize by 2050. Unfortunately, many in the environmental movement have set what I think of as completely unrealistic goals. They're talking about 2030. In fact, during the Democratic primaries, I knew many environmentalists who made fun of Joe Biden for being so slow and unambitious by saying that we would decarbonize only by 2050 instead of by 2030 like Bernie Sanders. But the proposal that Bernie Sanders was making didn't make any sense. It had us spending $16 trillion of government money, and it wasn't even clear that you could build all of the stuff you needed to build that quickly. So in my view, it's wonderful to have ambition. And I think the 2050 and for China, 2060 ambitions are wonderful. I personally think it's very unlikely that we're going to get there. I wish that weren't true. I'm working really hard to try to be wrong about this. But at the same time, the problem is really challenging. I think there's maybe right now a little bit too much discussion of when we're going to get to zero. The truth is, because it involves so much innovation and technological change, nobody really knows. And that's okay. We need to start taking steps, steady progress as rapidly as possible. And maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe we'll discover it'll be easier than we think. Right now, it looks incredibly difficult. But you know what? Instead of arguing about when we're going to get to carbon neutrality, let's take our first steps towards reducing our emissions, knowing that ultimately we do have to get to carbon neutrality. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. And you were talking about the technological change that is necessary. in order to be able to pursue carbon neutrality. And with your vast experience with energy technologies, what are some of the ways that we can leverage technology in order to accelerate the climate sustainability movement?
Well, it's interesting. We're in an incredibly exciting moment in energy systems because in the last few years, in many parts of the world, including in many parts of the US, solar power and wind power are actually cheaper than any form of electricity support generation. That's exciting. That's never been true. For my whole life, solar was so expensive that it had to be subsidized, and wind as well. When there was a federal tax credit on wind, people built wind, and when the tax credit went away, people stopped building wind. Currently, wind is the cheapest thing around in a windy place, whether it's near where you live in the Midwest or whether it's in various other parts of the world. And solar in sunny parts of the US is incredibly cheap and keeps getting cheaper, partly because of innovations in Chinese manufacturing. So here we are at this special moment in time. And what's going to happen next is we're going to start building more and more solar and wind. You know, during this year in 2020, the Department of Energy estimates that 75% of the new electricity generation capacity in the US is going to be wind and solar.
Wow.
And that's during the Trump presidency. President Trump hates wind energy, and still 75% of new electricity capacity is going to be wind and solar. That tells you that there's something special going on. So that's going to be the next phase. And we've never had the wind at our back, so to speak, in terms of the price being low. What else could encourage innovation? Well, some very simple things. Here in Massachusetts, and I suspect where you are as well, in the middle of the night when it's very windy, or in the middle of the day when it's very sunny, the price of electricity actually drops on the wholesale market. But for most people in their houses, we pay the same price for electricity all the time, whether it's in the middle of the night when nobody wants electricity, or whether it's in the late afternoon when everybody's coming home and turning on their appliances and what have you. So large industry gets real-time electricity pricing, but not residential customers. There are all sorts of simple things we could do that actually don't cost anything more, but could spur innovation. For example, imagine if we actually all paid the real-time price of electricity. And then when we bought electric vehicles, today in Massachusetts, I pay 22 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity. Wow. And so right now, it doesn't matter whether when I drive an electric vehicle and park in the evening and plug it in, I don't care whether it's in the evening when electricity is scarce because everybody else wants it too, or at 2 in the morning when nobody's using electricity. If I had real-time pricing, then I would actually have a smart meter that would actually charge my car in the middle of the night. And it would save me money, but it would also help the grid enormously. It would help us adapt to having more intermittent sources of electricity like solar and wind. So those are the kind of innovations that I can see coming. I can see electric vehicle prices coming way down, and ultimately decarbonizing every sector of the economy.
And it's so wonderful, all the things that you're talking about, especially at this moment with solar and wind power becoming more usable and becoming more prominent, and potentially using the real-time prices of electricity as well. And I think that at our current crossroads, another sort of situation of fighting the pandemic, the economic fallout, and the anti-racism movement, how can we make climate change meaningful and make it a meaningful part of the current conversation that we are having, and how can we leverage that traction for climate change during this election season?
So it's really interesting. I think that's a really hard question, and I wish I had some good news for you. Unfortunately, I'm not sure I do. There are many people who are hoping that COVID will lead to a green recovery, that we'll be able to have huge amounts of stimulus from the federal budget that will allow us to build infrastructure, that will rebuild our energy systems in a cleaner way. I fear that that optimism is misplaced. I think, unfortunately, the pandemic has hurt our economy tremendously, and that we're going to feel the effects of this for years. I think the pandemic was so poorly handled. More than 200,000 Americans are dead now, and we're still not out of the woods. There are many of us still at risk, essentially fear of death in the future. And that's going to hurt our economy, I think, for a very long time. And what that means is ultimately we're less rich, and therefore we have less money to spend on fixing the climate problem. I think we've seen this again and again. I think the idea that we're going to have trillions of dollars of new infrastructure investment, I'd love to be wrong about this, but I fear that that may be a long time before it actually ever happens. On the other hand, the issue of racism, I think, is a really good question, Sri, and I think it's an important aspect. And I think we have to be honest. The environmental movement in this country and around the world has been remarkably white. In general, environment has been something that wealthy people have treated as a luxury thing. People who cared about conservation of wilderness. And frankly, most people of color in this country living in maybe in inner cities or in other difficult conditions, economic conditions, frankly, the environment was very low on their list of concerns. I think we have to address that, and we have to be honest about that. Ultimately, climate change is about everybody. And the truth is that the people who are going to be most hurt by climate change are actually going to be people who are poorer, who didn't actually contribute that much to the problem in the first place. So there's a fundamental question of justice about climate change. And so as we move forward and think about solutions, we have to think about how to support the communities that are most vulnerable, who are often communities of color. So I think that has to be front and center, and it hasn't always been part of the conversation.
And Professor Schrag, what would your advice be for teens and youth now, and how can we be a part of the solution and be agents of change?
Well, I got to say, Sri, I think many of your classmates, people your age, have already been part of the solution. I mean, I was just looking the other day at the people, at the predictions for who's going to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And Greta Thunberg is at the top of the list, or near the top of the list. I have no idea whether she's worthy of that honor, but she certainly did make a stir in the world as a teenager. And the Sunrise Movement, somebody who's a little bit older, my friend Varshini Prakash is a young activist who's 25 or 26 years old, lives here in Boston, and started the Sunrise Movement with some of her friends. And that's had a huge impact on US politics in pushing action on climate change. So I would say what young people need to do is do exactly what those people have been doing, which is agitate. Frederick Douglass once long ago gave a young man advice on what to do to help change things. He said, agitate, agitate. And I think that's right. And that being said, those advocates and protesters, I think young people are understandably furious. They're inheriting a world with huge problems that they didn't create. And it's not clear that we can solve it. So when the Sunrise Movement says we want to decarbonize in 10 years, that's exactly what they should demand. Unfortunately, I know the truth, which is it's not going to happen. But that doesn't mean they're wrong to demand it. They're exactly right to demand it. And they should keep pressure on so that the older people like me who help make decisions should constantly feel the pressure to go faster, to do more. Because as much as we do, it's never going to be enough.
And I believe that one of your sayings is that the species that survive are not necessarily the most intelligent ones, but are the ones that are the most adaptable. And I think that plays.
Well, actually, let me be very clear. I didn't say that. Charles Darwin wrote that. He said that the species that survives is not just necessarily the smartest, not necessarily the swiftest, it's the one most adaptable to change. And I think there's something very wise in that. And no question, we're going to all be scrambling to adapt to climate change in the future. But there's this interesting aspect, again, you asked about young people, with a question of a type of justice that we don't normally talk about. And that's another connection to the COVID situation. I call it intergenerational equity. So with COVID, it's sort of the opposite. Young people, they get sick, but not nearly at the rates of old people, and the mortality is much, much, much lower. So essentially, young people are being asked to make sacrifices. You're going to school online, missing your senior year of high school, to help protect your parents, your grandparents, other people in the community who are more vulnerable to the disease. Well, for climate change, it's the opposite. We're being asked to make sacrifices. The truth is that the system has so much inertia, the timescales of the system are so long that we're likely to, well, the impacts of climate change are mostly baked in for me for the rest of my lifetime. I'm trying to make change so that you, or maybe your children or your children's children, will experience a much better future. And that's an interesting aspect of intergenerational equity. Unfortunately, my generation is not doing enough to protect your generation's future.
And I think that it's so important, and I'm very eager to see some of the questions that come up in tomorrow, or at the time of recording this, tomorrow's presidential debate, and the questions that climate change will propose in that debate as well. And Professor Schrag, thank you so much for your amazing contributions to the field of environment and to our country. And thank you so much for your time today.
Sri, it's great that you're doing this podcast, and I just think it's wonderful that you keep being curious and motivated. And again, communicating about these issues to the public is so important. Thanks for all your help with that.